start with the international non-proliferation regime being a network of multilateral treaties, regional agreements, international organizations, and informal arrangements and initiatives. And at the core of it all is the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, the NPT. It is a foundational instrument for the regime and therefore is often referred to as the cornerstone of the international non-proliferation regime. The treaty defines nuclear and non-nuclear weapon states and their basic obligations with regard to preventing the spread of nuclear weapons and achieving a world without nuclear weapons. And while it does not cover every aspect, every relevant aspect, the treaty contains aspirations for and promise of further measures and agreements on nuclear testing, on security assurances, and nuclear disarmament. It is indeed a quite concise treaty, but the core non-proliferation obligations are set out in Articles 1, 2, and 3. And there are different commitments for nuclear and non-nuclear weapon states. So the treaty as those that had manufactured and tested a nuclear explosive device by January 1, 1967. Everyone else, by definition, is a non-nuclear weapon state, even if they do happen to acquire nuclear weapons sometime down the road. So Article 1 of the NPT commits nuclear weapon states not to transfer nuclear weapons to any recipient whatsoever, and not to assist or encourage any non-nuclear weapon state to acquire or manufacture a nuclear weapon. Under Article 2, non-nuclear weapon states commit not to manufacture, acquire, or control nuclear weapons, or receive the transfer of nuclear weapons from anyone, and not to seek or receive assistance in the manufacture of nuclear weapons. To verify compliance with those non-proliferation obligations, non-nuclear weapon states agree to adopt safeguards on all nuclear materials in all peaceful nuclear activities on their territory or under their jurisdiction. States do so by concluding safeguards agreements with the International Atomic Energy Agency. Furthermore, all states commit not to provide nuclear materials and technology to non-nuclear weapon states that are not subject to safeguards. And that's Article 3 of the NPT. There was a lot of concern at the time of the negotiations that by foregoing a nuclear weapon option, non-nuclear weapon states would also miss out on the peaceful uses of the atom, which is why Article 4 of the NPT specifically acknowledges the inalienable right of states parties to pursue peaceful uses of nuclear energy, as long as that right is exercised in accordance with Article 1 and 2 of the NPT. And there is furthermore a pledge to provide assistance to states, especially taking into consideration the needs of developing countries in peaceful uses of the atom. That's Article 4. Stopping the spread of nuclear weapons to new countries was not the only concern of the NPT negotiators. Non-nuclear weapon states also wanted concrete commitments on nuclear disarmament. Ultimately, they were not able to include specific measures such as caps on arsenals or prohibition of nuclear testing in the treaty. However, Article 6 of the NPT does commit all states parties, nuclear and non-nuclear weapon states, to pursue good faith negotiations on effective measures towards stopping the nuclear arms race, achieving nuclear disarmament, and eventually concluding a treaty on general and complete disarmament. These are, I think, the main provisions of the NPT. There are others having to do with the right of withdrawal from the treaty, the right of states parties to get together and create regional nuclear weapon-free zones, an article regulating the review of the treaty's implementation, and also provisions on amendment and other issues. Safeguards are a set of technical measures designed to verify that nuclear material and technology remain in peaceful uses and are not diverted to the production of nuclear weapons. The international body that implements nuclear safeguards is the International Atomic Energy Agency, or the IAEA. It is an independent organization with its own statute, secretariat, and governing bodies. The IAEA predates the NPT and had been implementing nuclear safeguards for a decade by the time the treaty was concluded. So instead of creating a whole new organization, Article 3 of the NPT designates the IAEA as the implementing agency for verifying non-proliferation obligations. Before the NPT, the IAEA applied safeguards to specific facilities. But to do what the NPT asked it to do and apply safeguards to all nuclear material in a given state, the agency had to develop comprehensive safeguards, also known as full-scope safeguards. Non-nuclear weapon states party to the NPT are therefore required to conclude a comprehensive safeguards agreement with the IAEA. In the 1990s, the agency also implemented a program to strengthen safeguards and adopted Model Additional Protocol. This protocol is additional to the Comprehensive Safeguards Agreement and provides the IAEA with additional tools and access to verify the absence of undeclared nuclear material and activities in a given state. Many states now believe that the additional protocol should be considered part of the requirement of Article 3 of the NPT, but not everyone agrees. Only 5 states are not party to the NPT, and 4 of them possess or are believed to possess nuclear weapons. The 5th state is South Sudan. It's the newest independent state in the system. It is not nuclear armed and hopefully will join the treaty soon enough. Matters are a lot more complicated with the other 4, and these are India, Israel, Pakistan, and North Korea. India's opposition to the treaty began with the criticism of it establishing an unfair, discriminatory system of nuclear haves and have-nots. India actually participated in the negotiation of the NPT, but opposed the final text for these purposes. And it wasn't alone in its opposition on these grounds. Eventually, India developed its own nuclear weapons, and because it cannot join the treaty as a nuclear weapon state by definition, there is really no incentive right now for India to join the NPT because it's required to disarm. Pakistan is in a similar situation, and it has nuclear weapons. It cannot be a nuclear weapon state under the NPT, and is not likely to move on nuclear disarmament, at least until India does. And even then, it's sort of not a guarantee. Israel is part of a complicated equation in the Middle East, and it cites the regional security situation and lack of trust in other countries in the region as reasons not to join the NPT. Israel, of course, does not confirm or deny possessing nuclear weapons and has a very opaque stance on its nuclear status. The DPRK, North Korea, is also a special case unto itself. It is the only state that used to be party to the NPT and used the right of withdrawal. There's been a lot of controversy about whether or not they did so in a proper fashion. Importantly, North Korea, while being a party to the NPT, was never in compliance with its non-proliferation obligations. And so there is a strong opinion among states parties that North Korea should still be held accountable for violations of its safeguards commitments and commitments not to pursue nuclear weapons, even though it has officially withdrawn from the NPT. To put it shorter, all of the 4 countries that have nuclear weapons and are outside the NPT clearly have decided for one reason or another that they absolutely have to have nuclear weapons. And it doesn't seem likely that their mind will be changed in the foreseeable future. The 5 states recognized and defined as nuclear weapon states in the NPT, only 3 joined from the very beginning and are indeed the depositories of the treaty. These are United States, United Kingdom, and Russia, formerly the Soviet Union. People's Republic of China did not participate in the negotiations and did not join the treaty until 1992, despite being defined as a nuclear weapon state in the treaty. France, that also fits the definition of a nuclear weapon state under the NPT, did not join until 1992 as well. In accordance with Article 8 of the NPT, every 5 years, states parties convene for a review conference. A review conference is supposed to review and assess the implementation of the treaty, as well as decisions of past conferences. In 1995, at the Review and Extension Conference, states parties agreed that conferences should not only examine the past, but also set a forward-looking agenda. So along with reviewing the implementation of the treaty, review conferences need to agree on next steps and measures for states to implement. So that's been the evolution of the purpose of the review process over time. Structurally, also in 1995, states agreed on a sort of set formula that we've been following ever since, that review conference is preceded by 3 meetings of the preparatory committee in each of the 3 years preceding the review conference. And then we have sort of a gap year there. There is in principle an option to have a 4th PrepCon, but that has never happened before. Ideally, the review conference adopts by consensus an outcome document containing both the review of implementation and a forward-looking program of action. In practice, only about half of the review conferences to date have been able to agree on a final document. The review conference typically lasts for a week, takes place usually in New York, though in the past it also took place in Geneva. And the organization of the time and work is such that it begins with a general debate where states parties set out their positions overall on all the relevant issues and of implementation of the treaty and its future. And then work is delegated to 3 main committees. Main Committee 1 that deals with nuclear disarmament, Main Committee 2 that deals with non-proliferation and regional issues, and Main Committee 3 that deals with peaceful uses and other issues. And since the 2000 review conference, it's also been a custom to establish subsidiary bodies under each of the main committees to deal with a particular specific issue. For example, under the Main Committee 1, subsidiary body 1 usually focuses on the forward-looking action on disarmament. Subsidiary body 2 under Main Committee 2 usually focuses on the issue of the Middle East and other regional issues. And then under Main Committee 3, Subsidiary Body 3 has in the past focused on questions such as further strengthening the review of the treaty, improving its effectiveness of the process, and also questions of how to respond to the cases of withdrawal from the NPT. Once the main committees conclude their work or simply run out of time, they forward their documents, ideally agreed by consensus reports, to the president of the conference, who then works to put all the pieces together and present a final document for states parties to either negotiate further or agree as is. One of the provisions of the NPT states that the treaty should be enforced initially for 25 years, and at the end of that 25-year period, states parties have to decide whether to extend the treaty indefinitely or by some set amount of time. And so 1995 was the time when that decision had to be made. So perhaps the most important decision in all of the NPT review process history was in 1995, where states agreed that, yes, the treaty will continue in force indefinitely. Along with that decision, they also adopted a decision on strengthening the review process and the decision on principles and objectives for nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. The final part of that package was a resolution on establishment of a zone free of nuclear weapons and all other weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East. The 2000 Review Conference adopted a comprehensive consensus final document, which, among other things, contained 13 practical steps for nuclear disarmament. And that is the set of decisions that is very often referenced in the subsequent review conferences and other review process meetings. In 2010, states parties were successful in adopting a 64-item action plan on nuclear disarmament, non-proliferation, and peaceful uses, as well as a set of recommendations for the implementation of the 1995 resolution on the Middle East. So these decisions of these 3 conferences form something that diplomats like calling the NPT acquis. Their implementation is reviewed along with the implementation of the treaty itself in the subsequent review conferences. The states whose support for extension was key was Egypt. And Egypt's price for support, or at least not blocking the decision on the indefinite extension, was addressing the question of Israel and Israel having nuclear weapons and not being party to the NPT. And so after negotiating with the United States in particular, but also Russia and United Kingdom, they reached an agreement that the three depositories of the NPT, UK, US, and Russia, will co-sponsor a resolution sort of proclaiming the goal of establishing a zone free of nuclear and other weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East, which places a particular responsibility on them to pursue that goal, but it also calls for all other states to exert effort in this regard. And so Egypt and other Middle Eastern countries view the resolution as an essential part of that package of decisions that allowed the treaty to be extended indefinitely. And many countries around the world support that view. The issue with the Middle East resolution is that it didn't contain any specific actionable provisions. So what was necessary was to have some kind of plan for implementation, which didn't materialize at least until 2010. So 2010 was the first time that the review conference adopted more specific steps to be implemented to support the creation of a zone free of nuclear weapons and other WMD in the Middle East. And so every time that the review conference gathers to review implementation of the treaty and past decisions, of course, the question of what has been done to implement the resolution on the Middle East comes up. And in most cases, it is a controversial one. And along with nuclear disarmament, it's really seen as a make or break issue for every review conference. The decision on strengthening the review process has not been fully implemented. It was in a sense, it was a great aspiration because one of the provisions and one of the standings in 95 and then clarified in 2000 was that, for example, the preparatory committee meetings will deal not only with procedural issues, but will also take up matters of substance and develop recommendations for the review conference. Ideally, the third PrepCom should adopt, by consensus, recommendations for the review conference that can then be forwarded to the conference president. In practice, that has never happened. And states want to keep their powder dry. It's understandable. They don't want to engage in negotiations and adopt things by consensus before the time for the actual review conference comes. The result of it is that we have a set of 3 meetings that is 2 weeks long each. And in the end, it's very hard to explain what's been achieved in these meetings other than procedural decisions. So that's the reason why a lot of countries and experts have raised the question of whether we can use that time during the PrepComs more effectively. Maybe it would be possible to have each PrepCom focus on a specific area or specific pillar of the NPT. The first PrepCom, for example, focusing on non-proliferation issues because it's taking place in Vienna. This is where the RDA is based, etc. Or have the second PrepCom focus on disarmament issues because it's taking place in Geneva. But the pushback is that states want to discuss all issues and maintain balance at every meeting of the review process. So it didn't seem feasible to just designate specific issues to specific PrepComs. Another issue is that the NPT does not have its own dedicated organization. The United Nations Office for Disarmament Affairs serves as a secretariat, but UNODA has a very broad mandate, a lot of other issues on their plate, so they can't dedicate themselves entirely to the NPT. And so there have been suggestions at previous review conferences to establish a dedicated secretariat within UNODA, so designated person working only on the NPT. I think the opposition to that was more political than pragmatic, and the proposal was not successful. Furthermore, we again, because states tend to not want to adopt consensus documents at the PrepComs, basically we have in-depth discussion and negotiation on the treaty implementation every 5 years. Some other treaties and conventions have annual meetings of states parties, and that allows for sort of more continuity, keeping a finger on the pulse better. Some proposals in the past have addressed that question, whether we should have more frequent meetings that have that would adopt documents and decisions. And that also didn't go very far. And in general, the pushback has been that it's not a procedural problem. The fact that the review conferences so often fail to adopt outcome documents is not the problem of the process itself and its organization. It's really the matter of political will. Progress on nuclear disarmament has been a central issue to every NPT review conference since the treaty entered into force. And that is understandable because that was the most aspirational provision that in the treaty lacks any specifics in terms of measures, in terms of timelines, implementing organizations. And so in part, the NPT review process itself was meant to increase accountability, to give non-nuclear weapon states in particular a way to sort of hold the nuclear weapon states' feet to the fire and periodically ask for progress on nuclear disarmament in particular. And so the next review conference will not be different in that regard. I would expect nuclear disarmament to be central, all the more because of the terrible situation we find ourselves in terms of the state of the nuclear arms control architecture and crisis of relations between some of the nuclear weapon states and complete lack of trust. And that I think will be a central topic at the next review conference. The Middle East, which, as I said, usually tends to be contentious, may or may not be central next time. It in part depends on the progress of the new process that was established in the UN General Assembly of annual conferences on the Middle East nuclear weapon-free zone. So depending on how that goes and how some of the nuclear weapon states in particular react to it, will define whether or not the question of the Middle East is controversial as it usually is at the 10th Review Conference. The situation with Iran and the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, I think also would be quite central to the discussions at the review conference. And another issue that's really been gaining traction, more so than in previous review cycles, is the role of peaceful uses of the atom and how the NPT can better support peaceful uses, can better promote peaceful uses. This is the province of the IAEA. It's part of the IAEA mandate to promote and provide assistance in peaceful uses. But because the NPT has peaceful uses as one of its 3 pillars, there's been a feeling among some states parties, at least, that more could be done in this regard and that not enough attention has been paid to the question of peaceful uses in previous review conferences. Central issues that emerged during this review cycle and is likely to be quite prominent at the review conference is the status of past commitments. Not everyone apparently agrees that they constitute a part of NPT acquis and that they are binding in any way. And so that is very troubling for states parties who, in good faith, adopt consensus documents containing those decisions, those next steps, full expecting them to be implemented. And so one of the positive developments, I think, recently has been this greater unity among states parties in reaffirming the validity of past commitments and insisting that there ought to be a way to not only reaffirm our support for them, but also build on them. And one thing that the review conference should focus on is developing perhaps more specific targets, benchmarks for steps that they identify as priorities deriving from the past decisions, including the 2010 action plan, but they also could revisit the 2000 practical steps and all the way back to the 1995 principles and objectives. I think there is a possibility that states focus on this between now and the review conference and come up with concrete proposals on how to take forward past commitments. Nuclear risk reduction has become a kind of a buzz topic in the past review cycle. The reasons for it are not very encouraging, because it's really the growing perception of an increased risk of use of nuclear weapons. So the proliferation of studies and conversations on nuclear risk reduction is a response to people being worried that the threshold to using nuclear weapons is being lowered. At the same time, it has raised some very interesting issues and thus possibly open some opportunities for further steps at the next review conference. But as far as I know, there's very little agreement on nuclear risk reduction measures among the nuclear weapon states themselves. But to the extent that the review conference can push them to work on this issue further, I think that would be a useful development. 20 NPT review conference, we saw the emergence of at least one new international initiative trying to identify steps that most of the member states parties could agree on and adopt at the review conference. It's called a Stepping Stones, and it was spearheaded by Sweden, and it's had a couple of ministerial meetings now, and they continue their preparations, I understand, for the 10th NPT review conference. They bring together more sort of the moderate middle power states in an attempt to identify the areas where progress is most likely, where that's perhaps the most significant development as far as cross-regional groupings in the NPT go. In terms of the issues themselves, nuclear risk reduction has certainly been on the top of the agenda for many states, and one of the challenges for the review conference, and particularly for nuclear weapon state, is to reaffirm that a nuclear war cannot be won and should never be fought. I think it is fundamental to provide the assurance that states are not envisioning the use of nuclear weapons lightly, and that offers an opportunity for the next review conference.
So what are the origins of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons? Well, to answer that question, you actually need to start back in 1995, when the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty of 1968 was indefinitely extended. And that treaty had originally been for a duration of 25 years, but in 1995, a package was put together and agreed to by states parties to extend the treaty indefinitely. And the NPT really revolves around a grand bargain. And part of that grand bargain is the commitment to nuclear disarmament by the 5 nuclear weapon states. But by the late 2000s, it was becoming pretty clear that very limited, if any, progress was being made on Article 6. And there were all sorts of signs of increasing tension between some of the nuclear weapon states by that stage. And ongoing modernization programs, which were adding to the capabilities of these states. And this concern, combined with an emergent sort of humanitarian disarmament approach, which we saw, for example, in prohibitions on anti-personnel mines through the Mine Ban Treaty in 1997, and the conventional cluster munitions in 2008, led some to think about how these sorts of approaches might have some relevance in the context of nuclear weapons. And in the 2010 NPT review conference, for the first time, there was language in the final outcome of that meeting that referred to the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons. And this was important because it was a very useful handle for states parties to the NPT to begin talking about and holding events about the humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons. And from 2013, there were a series of humanitarian consequences conferences, the first held by the Norwegian government in early 2013, and then subsequent conferences in Nayarit in Mexico the following February, and at the end of 2014, a conference in Vienna. And these were attended by many states, and these underlined some basic humanitarian messages about nuclear weapons. And this in turn contributed to momentum toward a process that might work on a legally binding instrument to complement the NPT. So in 2016, there was a UN open-ended working group on taking forward multilateral nuclear disarmament, which met here in Geneva under the chairship of Thailand. And eventually that OEWG agreed a report in August 2016, in which, amongst its recommendations, it recommended the idea of a treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons. And that was followed up with a UNGA resolution, which led to the emergence of a process within the UN to negotiate such a treaty. And that was done very rapidly. In July 2017, the negotiations were basically carried out in New York over a period of 3 weeks. And at the end of that, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons was adopted. So what is the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons about? Well, I'm actually holding it here in my hands. It's not a very thick document. It's just a few pages long, but it's an important document. So what this does is it is a comprehensive and non-discriminatory prohibition on the possession, development, use, transfer, or reliance on nuclear weapons. And it contains a number of different kinds of provisions which relate to this. So first of all, it contains the prohibitions that I just mentioned. But in addition to that, it also has implications for states that may not have nuclear weapons, but which rely on nuclear deterrence. It prohibits some activities in that regard. And it also contains what we call positive obligations. So these are provisions within the treaty that obligate states parties to, first of all, assist victims and affected communities on their territories or within their jurisdiction from the consequences of the testing or use of nuclear weapons, and also to provide for environmental remediation. But it doesn't just leave those states parties on their own. Beside the provisions in Article 6, it also contains provisions for other states parties in a position to do so to provide assistance to other states parties in meeting those obligations. There are also a number of other things which are important in the treaty. So, for instance, if a state that has had nuclear weapons of its own, or which has had nuclear weapons on its territory, for instance, there are some states in Europe that participate in so-called nuclear sharing. Then there are provisions within the TPNW, if they join the treaty, for essentially verifying that nuclear weapons have either been removed from their territory, or if they're a possessor of nuclear weapons, that those nuclear weapons are dismantled and destroyed. And these so-called Article 4 provisions relate to things like setting up a competent international authority that would in effect negotiate agreements to do that with nuclear armed states. And there are also deadlines for nuclear weapons to be destroyed after they join the treaty, and you know, other aspects as well. And in addition, there are the usual kind of provisions you would expect in a treaty of this kind. Things like, you know, how do you hold conferences of states parties, universalization of the treaty, and so forth, depositories, amendments to the treaty, etc., etc. So while the TPNW was adopted in July 2017, it entered into force in January 2021. And this year, after a couple of postponements because of the COVID-19 pandemic, the states parties to the TPNW will hold their first meeting of states parties in late June in Vienna. And this is a real cause for celebration. So the TPNW itself mandates the First Conference of States Parties to make a couple of key decisions. For instance, on the deadline for states to remove nuclear weapons for their territory, as well as deadlines for nuclear armed states that join the treaty to destroy their nuclear weapons. So there needs to be progress made on that. There needs to be progress made on setting up intercessional mechanisms so that the work of the treaty regime can be carried forward. And these entail areas such as universalization of the treaty, making good on its positive obligations on victim assistance and environmental remediation, and in a range of kind of other areas as well. And one dimension of the treaty regime is that it's going to be setting up a scientific advisory group to feed into states parties' decision-making. And this will be, I think, an important innovation for the TPNW in order for it to obtain scientific advice, both for the purposes of positive obligations, but most of all, for the purposes of ensuring that the kinds of verification arrangements it puts in place for nuclear armed or allied states that eventually join the treaty to provide assurance that they are complying with the treaty's prohibitions. So there are a bunch of these processes that need to be set up. There will probably also be progress made in other respects, including, for example, setting up an international trust fund to assist those who've been impacted by the use or testing of nuclear weapons, and a bunch of sundry other decisions which are quite important. And in terms of the package that comes out of the first meeting of states parties, there will probably be a political declaration, as is usual for these sorts of meetings, which underlines the core tenets of the regime. There'll also probably be an action plan which sets up some concrete, specific steps that states parties need to get on with the assistance of experts and civil society, with a view to making good on its provisions, with a view to the second meeting of states parties, which will be held 2 years later.
It's a pleasure to talk to you today about nuclear weapon-free zones. And indeed, I often talk about them as kind of a good story, a feel-good story of non-proliferation. It's one of those successes that can be rare in this field. And indeed, nuclear weapon-free zones are often recognized by the UN fora and NPT meetings for their contribution to regional security, nuclear non-proliferation, and disarmament. And clearly, nuclear weapon-free zones reinforce the non-proliferation commitments of their states parties. But beyond that, they also aim to limit sort of the freedom of action with regard to the nuclear weapons and nuclear weapon states. And when thinking and talking about nuclear weapon-free zones and their relationship with disarmament, I often remember the words of Alfonso Garcia Robles, a Mexican diplomat and a Nobel Peace Prize winner, who played an important part in the establishment of a nuclear weapon-free zone in Latin America and the Caribbean. And so, speaking to the UN General Assembly in 1974, he highlighted that one of the goals of nuclear weapon-free zones is to shrink the areas of the world where nuclear weapons are seen as legitimate. So part of the contribution of nuclear weapon-free zones to achieving nuclear disarmament is to limit the areas where nuclear weapons are seen and used as legitimate instruments of security. So beyond committing its states parties to not acquire nuclear weapons, the zones also prohibit the placement of nuclear weapons by other states on the territory of the zone. They would prohibit testing, they would prohibit the deployment and a range of other activities that I think over time it builds this kind of norm that nuclear weapons are not seen as part of the security equation for that particular region. So the idea about creating an area completely free of nuclear weapons dates back to the 1950s. And some of the early proposals had to do with establishing a zone in Central Europe as a kind of a buffer between the Soviet bloc and NATO. That did not work out for various political reasons, but other regions took note and sort of picked up that idea. And the first zone free of nuclear weapons is established by the Antarctic Treaty, which, among other things, prohibits the placement of nuclear weapons in Antarctica. And the very first nuclear weapon-free zone in a densely inhabited territory was established by the Treaty of Tlatelolco in Latin America in 1967, which even predated the signature, the conclusion of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But what is a nuclear weapon-free zone? So the UN General Assembly, different UN subsidiary bodies have addressed this question of the definition of a nuclear weapon-free zone and the requirements for a nuclear weapon-free zone several times. A resolution adopted in 1975 establishes kind of a two-part definition of a nuclear weapon-free zone. One defines the concept itself, and the other defines the principal obligations of nuclear weapon states with regard to the zones. So part one stipulates that a nuclear weapon-free zone is an international agreement among any group of states on the total absence of nuclear weapons on the territory of the zone under an international system of verification and control. So you can see from the definition that there are several requirements already for something to be recognized internationally as the zone. It has to be a legally binding treaty. It has to have a clear definition of a territory. It has to establish provisions for complete absence of nuclear weapons within that defined territory, and it should have provisions for verification. And then later in 1999, the UN Disarmament Commission, as part of its report, adopted a set of guidelines for the establishment of nuclear weapon-free zones. This, of course, happened after most of the existing nuclear weapon-free zones were already created. So the UN drew on the experience of already existing zones, as well as built on the expert study that was conducted back in the 1970s. And there, the guidelines underscore that the initiative for creating a zone should come from the region itself, that the consultations and negotiations on the zone should involve all the relevant states, and ideally nuclear weapon states should be consulted in the process. And the guidelines also reinforce the concept that was adopted in 1978, that nuclear weapon-free zones should be established on the basis of arrangements freely arrived at by the states of the region concerned. And that's a very important founding principle for any nuclear weapon-free zone. It means that the creation of a zone cannot be mandated from outside the region. It can't be, a Security Council resolution telling the countries to establish a zone. It really has to be a regional initiative and a regional process. Further UN guidelines stipulate that the adherence to various regional and international arrangements should not entail obligations that are contrary to the provisions of a nuclear weapon-free zone treaty. So you can't be a party to a nuclear weapon-free zone, for example, that prohibits the placement of nuclear weapons on the territory of the zone, and at the same time be party to a military alliance that allows the placement of nuclear weapons on the territory of a country. So that's an important provision. At the same time, the UN guidelines recognize that states should retain the right to allow the sort of innocent passage, visit, or overflight of vehicles, ships, and aircraft carrying nuclear weapons. And that's an important principle for several of the existing nuclear weapon-free zones. There are other guidelines, but generally this kind of the set of agreed requirements for the zones. And to be recognized as a zone, you have to have the basically recognition of the UN General Assembly. So today we have 5 nuclear weapon-free zones in existence. and one state with the UN recognized sort of special nuclear weapon-free status. That's Mongolia. The 5 zones are Latin America and Caribbean, established by the Treaty of Tlatelolco, the South Pacific Nuclear-Free Zone, established by the Treaty of Rarotonga, the Southeast Asian Nuclear Weapon-Free Zone, established by the Treaty of Bangkok, the African Nuclear Weapon-Free Zone, established by the Treaty of Pelindaba, and the Central Asian Nuclear Weapon-Free Zone. Other zones all the same? Well, there are certain common features across the zonal treaties. A lot of them have to do with the main prohibitions. The prohibitions contained in the zone, they are significantly more elaborate than the non-proliferation obligations under the Non-Proliferation Treaty for the non-nuclear weapon states. So nuclear weapon-free zones typically ban the development, manufacturing, control, possession, and transporting of nuclear weapons by the parties to the zone. Furthermore, they ban stationing of nuclear weapons by other states within the territory of the zone. And also they ban testing of nuclear weapons on the territory of the zones. And so those provisions appeared many, many years before the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, for example, was concluded. And as I mentioned before, none of the zones currently explicitly prohibits transit of nuclear weapons. They leave that to the sovereign decision of each state party. In terms of positive obligations, all of the nuclear weapon-free zone treaties require verification, and currently all of them rely on the International Atomic Energy Agency for implementing the verification provisions. All zones require at least the acceptance of comprehensive safeguards agreements, and Central Asian Nuclear Weapon-Free Zone, which is the youngest treaty, requires also the additional protocol. All the zones except for the Treaty of Tlatelolco also require safeguards as condition of supply of nuclear material and technology to non-nuclear weapon states. The exact definitions vary a little bit, but the most far-reaching requirement is contained again in the Central Asian Nuclear Weapon-Free Zone, where the states parties commit to require both the Comprehensive Safeguards Agreement and the additional protocol as condition of nuclear supply. What else is common across all the zones is that all of them have protocols stipulating the obligations of nuclear weapon states vis-a-vis the given zone. And 4 of the 5 zonal treaties also have protocols stipulating the obligations of other states with territories under their control within the zones. For example, the Netherlands has territories under its control within the zone in Latin America and Caribbean. And so the Netherlands have signed and ratified the appropriate protocol, promising to respect the obligations, respect the provisions of the zone. And basically these protocols are the main ones that stipulate the relationship between nuclear weapon-free zones and nuclear weapon states. In that regard, the protocols typically require nuclear weapon states to commit not to place nuclear weapons within the zone, not to test nuclear weapons within the zone, and abstain from threatening the zonal parties from using nuclear weapons against them. The approaches of nuclear weapon states to nuclear weapon-free zones have varied depending on the state and the particular zone. The United States has been the most sort of reserved and cautious about signing and ratifying the protocols, and the US is the only one that has put forth a set of principles that guides their consideration of whether or not they would sign and ratify a particular protocol. So far, the United States has ratified the protocol to only one, all the relevant protocols to only one zone, and that's the Latin American Caribbean Treaty of Tlatelolco. It has signed protocols to other zonal treaties, the Central Asian, the African, and South Pacific, but has not yet ratified them. And the Bangkok Treaty is the only one right now that hasn't yet opened the protocol for signature due to some differences between the zonal parties and the nuclear weapon states. In terms of other differences between the zones, of course, there are some. They have had somewhat different approaches to defining the territory of the zone. For example, the South Pacific has very specific coordinates listed in the treaty, whereas the Central Asian and the African zone, they name the countries that are eligible. Some of the zones contain prohibitions and positive obligations that others do not. The Treaty of Pelindaba prohibits nuclear weapons research, for example, and also mandates the reversal of existing nuclear weapons programs. And that's sort of the legacy having to do with South Africa's nuclear weapon program before the establishment of the Pelindaba, before the establishment of the African nuclear zone. The Treaty of Pelindaba also prohibits attacks on civilian nuclear facilities. The Central Asian nuclear weapon-free zone commits its state parties to ensure physical protection of nuclear material and equipment in line with the IAEA guidelines and recommendations. That's not something that you would typically find in a nuclear weapon-free zone. And then they have different language and obligations in different zones pertaining to, for example, dumping of radioactive waste or importation of radioactive waste into the territory of the zone. And what varies greatly between the zones is the level of institutionalization. Whether or not a zone actually creates a body or a secretariat. So the Treaty of Tlatelolco and the Treaty of Pelindaba both mandate the establishment of an implementing body. In the case of Latin America, it is OPANAL, and in the case of Africa, this is AFCOM. The bodies have slightly different mandates and focus, but at least both zones have a very clear focal point in terms of a permanent organization with a secretary. Other zones rely on pre-existing regional organizations for secretariat services. In the case of Southeast Asia, this is ASEAN. In the case of South Pacific Nuclear Free Zone, this is the Pacific Island Forum. And Central Asia is the only one, I think, that doesn't have any kind of organization to serve as a permanent secretariat. And there you have a rotation of coordinators and focal points. And those differences, in particular in the institutionalization, they have implications for the ability of nuclear weapon-free zones to communicate and cooperate effectively. And that's been one of the challenges that the zones have discussed lately about the ways to improve the coordination and cooperation among the existing zones. For a long time, there was no established mechanism for exchange of information and coordination among the zones. And that was part of the reason that several countries, particularly in Latin America, championed the establishment of a periodic conference of states, parties, and signatories of nuclear weapon-free zone treaties. And the first conference took place in 2005 in Mexico City, and then they decided to have those zonal conferences be associated with the NPT review conferences. And so the next one took place 5 years later, right before the NPT RevCon in 2010 in New York. And the next one took place in 2015. And the fourth conference was planned to take place before the 10th NPT review conference, but because of the pandemic, it got postponed. And right now it's not, the status of the convening of the fourth conference of the states, parties, and signatories of nuclear weapon-free zone treaties is unclear. So the conferences is one way for states parties to sort of check notes, to discuss their priorities, to adopt a common declaration, not only reaffirming the principles underpinning the nuclear weapon-free zones, not only to call collectively on nuclear weapon states to sign, ratify relevant protocols, etc., but also to set some kind of forward-looking agenda for their cooperation and coordination. However, it hasn't been really enough because a conference every 5 years is not enough to have a sustained cooperation if you don't have a follow-up, if you don't have an established mechanism, if you don't have clear focal points and organizations that can communicate. And there's been some discussion both in the expert circles and among the diplomats about ways to improve that. OpenAL has taken in the leadership in particular in this conversation, but also states like Kazakhstan, who took up the idea of the need to improve the cooperation and coordination between the existing zones. And one of the positive things that happened in the past several years is the creation of the Nuclear Weapon Free Zones portal on the website of the UN Office for Disarmament Affairs. And that's the first centralized place on the internet where you can find general information about the zones and where the zones can also submit updates about their activities and about their cooperation. And we've seen some improvement in terms of communication between the Latin American zone and the African zone. And also Kazakhstan hosted a meeting specifically to discuss cooperation among the zones and Mongolia. The map of the zones, you'll see that they cover the entirety of the southern hemisphere, and one zone is located entirely in the northern hemisphere. That's the Central Asian Nuclear Weapon Free Zone. So that's almost half of the globe kind of still left uncovered, and there have been proposals for new nuclear weapon free zones since at least the 1970s. There's been a proposal for a nuclear weapon free zone in South Asia, covering India and Pakistan in particular. There have been conversations about a nuclear weapon free zone in Northeast Asia, and that had a lot to do with the issue on the Korean Peninsula, and some proposals in the 1980s about an Arctic nuclear weapon free zone. Unfortunately, none of these discussions are particularly active at the moment, and the prospects are rather dim for a variety of reasons. Central among them is the value that the countries in question within those territories attach to nuclear weapons, either by possessing them and actually having them as part of their arsenal, or the role that they assign to nuclear weapons through the extended nuclear deterrence guarantees, for example. So it's, as far as these proposals go, the prospects are not very good. The only zone that is part of the very active discussion, the only future potential zone that is part of the very active discussion right now is the Middle East zone, free of nuclear weapons and all other weapons of mass destruction. And that concept also dates back to the 1970s. It was a proposal by Iran that was picked up by Egypt very quickly, and Egypt has served as the key champion of the idea ever since then. And the issue is famously part of the NPT review process now since 1995, when as part of a package of decisions to extend the NPT indefinitely, states parties also adopted a resolution calling for the establishment of a weapon-free zone, WMD-free zone in the Middle East. And their work has been done in fits and starts. We have not reached yet the point of negotiations. There is now a new process established through the UN General Assembly of annual conferences to address the issue. We've had only one conference so far, and because of the COVID pandemic, again, the second conference has not yet taken place. And the question will most certainly be an important one at the upcoming 10th NPT Review Conference, where it will be once again time to check what has been done and what could be done going forward to spearhead the establishment of the zone.
Hello, and welcome to this short presentation about the Biological Weapons Convention. My name is Daniel Feeks, and I'm the Chief of the Biological Weapons Convention Implementation Support Unit based here in the Office for Disarmament Affairs in Geneva. I'm just going to give you a fairly quick overview of the convention now and its current status. Obviously, I'm happy to answer any questions. You can contact us through our contact details, which will be shown at the end of this presentation. Just to give you on one slide a quick overview of the BWC, it's a comprehensive convention that, as you can see, prohibits the development, production, stockpiling, acquisition, retention, or transfer of biological weapons. It's also a fairly old convention. It was opened for signature in 1972 and entered into force in 1975. So this year is actually the 50th anniversary of the convention's opening for signature. It was the first multilateral disarmament convention to ban an entire category of weapons of mass destruction. It does so through its 15 main articles. As I said before, it has a comprehensive scope. It's non-discriminatory in its nature. All states that join the convention must destroy any biological weapons if they possess them. And it's open to all states to join. And so far, 183 states, so the vast majority of states in the world, have actually joined the convention. There are remaining 14 states that haven't yet joined. There's 4 signatory states and 10 states that have not yet signed or ratified the convention. We're hoping that very soon that number will increase to 184. Namibia is very close to acceding to the Biological Weapons Convention. As I mentioned, the convention has a comprehensive scope. This is a selection. This is not all 15 of the articles, but this is a selection of the primary articles of the convention, ranging from Article 1, which sets out the scope and the prohibitions of the convention, through to the other articles that cover various issues relating to transfer, to national implementation, consultation, investigation, assistance, and also not hampering the peaceful uses of biology under Article 10 down there at the bottom of this slide. So the main functions of the Biological Weapons Convention are as follows. It provides an unequivocal norm against biological weapons. It really functions as the single multilateral forum for dialogue on all issues relating to the convention in a comprehensive manner. It supports the promotion of the peaceful uses of biological science and technology, and also facilitates assistance and cooperation for capacity building, particularly for developing countries. The convention also provides a mechanism for consultation and cooperation to resolve any issues or ambiguities, and it also enhances transparency through confidence building among its states parties as well, mainly through the mechanism of the annual reporting under the confidence building measures system. So how does the convention work? Again, in a nutshell, just to stress at the very beginning, unlike some other conventions in this area in terms of weapons of mass destruction disarmament, particularly the Chemical Weapons Convention, for example, in contrast to that, the Biological Weapons Convention has no international verification regime. It has no separate international organization. The implementation support unit that I head here in Geneva is a very small team of only 3 people based within the Office for Disarmament Affairs of the United Nations. So without a central kind of oversight organization like, for example, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons for the CWC, the Biological Weapons Convention really functions through its states parties, and its states parties translating their international obligations that they signed up to when joining the convention into effective action at the domestic, at the national level. At the international level, the convention really functions through a series of annual diplomatic meetings. These are the ones that you will all be familiar with or become familiar with in your time here in Geneva. Between review conferences, which themselves take place every 5 years, there's what's known as the Intercessional work programs. These are annual meetings at the technical and at the political level. The review conferences themselves are the highest organs of the Biological Weapons Convention. They generally take place every 5 years. There's slight changes sometimes, particularly in the last couple of years due to the COVID-19 pandemic. But we have the 9th review conference coming up. It should have taken place last November, but it's coming up this November and December. It will be presided over by Ambassador Leonardo Bencini, who's the newly arrived permanent representative of Italy to the Conference on Disarmament. The BWC, the 183 states parties to the BWC, are organized into three regional groups. It's the Eastern European Group, which is currently coordinated by the Russian Federation, the Group of the Non-Aligned Movement, coordinated by Azerbaijan, and the Western Group, which is coordinated by Australia. As I mentioned earlier, the BWC is a fairly old convention, which means it predates the approach where the Secretary General of the UN would be the depository of a multilateral treaty like this. So in fact, the BWC, instead of having the Secretary General as its depository, has three depository governments, which are the Russian Federation, the United Kingdom, and the United States. And they primarily play a role when states join the convention. They receive the instruments of ratification, accession, or succession. And the convention also operates on a fairly small budget. I say small in comparison to other treaties in the weapons of mass destruction area, for example, the Chemical Weapons Convention. The budget for the BWC in a normal year, so when there's when the review conference is not happening, the budget is around about 1.5 million US dollars per year. That covers the costs of us in the implementation support unit and primarily the costs of the meetings, so the interpreters, the documentation, and everything that is involved in the multilateral meetings that take place here in Geneva. So just one slide on the intercessional program. So this is as I mentioned, this is the program of work which basically happens between the 5-yearly review conferences. As you can see here, this has from 2018 to 2020. This has consisted of a series of annual meetings. There have been 5 what we call meetings of experts. These take place back to back, usually in the summertime. These are at the technical, at the expert level. And you can see the different topics that they cover here. There's basically 8 days worth of back-to-back meetings, with those 8 days spread between the 5 separate meetings you can see here and the topics which they discuss. So some meetings obviously take 2 days, some are only 1 day. And then the outputs from those meetings are considered later in the year by the more political meeting, which is the meeting of states parties, which generally takes place in November or December for a duration of 4 days. Now, as I mentioned, that's the pattern of meetings that takes place between review conferences. And I mentioned before, the review conferences generally take place every 5 years. And you can see here the quote from Article 12 of the Convention, which interestingly only mentioned one, as you can see here, one conference of states parties taking place 5 years after the Convention entered into force. So that first review conference did indeed take place in 1980. 5 years after the convention entered into force, and that agreed that another review conference should take place. So basically each review conference has had to agree that another one should take place, and more recently the review conferences have decided that they should take place on a 5-yearly basis. But again, that is not actually in the convention itself. The convention only refers to the very first review conference. And Article 12, as you can see here with the underlined text, basically sets out what the review conferences should do as well. You can see it says that they are to review the operation of the convention, and it also gives them a specific mandate to take into account any new scientific and technological developments that are relevant to the convention as well. And in recent years, for the last, say, 3-4 review conferences, they've also taken on a role of really setting the path, setting the agenda for the next 5 years. So not only a retrospective review of how the convention has operated for the past 5 years, but also setting the approach, the next intercessional program basically for the next 5 years, because as I mentioned earlier, none of this is set in stone. The intercessional programs, the implementation support unit, even subsequent review conferences, as I mentioned, are not set in stone in the convention. They have to be agreed and renewed by each review conference itself, and all decisions have to be taken by consensus at the review conferences. This slide just gives you an overview of the previous review conferences. I mentioned they've generally taken place every 5 years with some variations. Again, their duration has generally been 3 weeks, again, with little variations here and there. Every review conference so place has taken place at the United Nations office at Geneva. The rules of procedure of the review conferences have been unchanged since 1991, when the third review conference took place. So they're very, very well known to people. And as I said, they're also used for every other BWC meeting as well, including the meetings of experts and the meetings of states parties. Differently to those meetings, for the review conference itself, formal credentials are required. So for those of you who will be attending, you will need to be getting from your governments, from your authorities back in capital, the formal credentials signed by the appropriate person in capital to attend and to participate in the review conference. And there's a credentials committee established in the review conference that receives and checks those credentials as well. And the budget used to be funded by states, just those states parties participating in the conference. These days it's funded by all states parties, whether or not they participate in the conference. You can see here also an overview of past review conference presidents as well, the countries from which they come and the regional groups which they represent. You can see there's a couple of times where the kind of usual regional, the rotation between the regional groups has been adjusted. You can see one time back in 1991 that happened. And as many of you will be aware, much more recently this year, in fact, the 9th review conference should have been presided over by the NAM group, but earlier this year the NAM group handed its turn on to another interested regional group. Following some discussions and consultations, that regional group is the Western group, and as I mentioned earlier, Ambassador Bencini from Italy is the president designate of the upcoming 9th review conference. So in terms of preparations for the review conference, and as I mentioned, it's coming up, it begins in late November, taking place for 3 weeks into December this year. So obviously for many of you that are here in Geneva or will be arriving in Geneva, this will obviously be one of the big events on the disarmament calendar in the coming months. There is a big burden, first of all, placed on the review conference. As I intimated earlier, it is the only body, the only meeting within the Biological Weapons Convention that is actually mandated to take substantive decisions. I mentioned already about the decisions to renew the Implementation Support Unit, for example, to renew an intercessional work program. Those decisions are taken by the review conference, not by the annual meetings. So there's a big burden in that respect on the upcoming review conference. Clearly, COVID-19, the pandemic, had an impact. I mentioned already the review conference should have taken place last November. It's actually been postponed because the meetings that should have taken place before it were also postponed by 1 year. So the review conference itself also had to be postponed. The preparatory process for the review conference is especially important. Obviously, the conference itself is important, but the process leading up to that. We've actually just completed the formal preparatory process with the conclusion of the preparatory committee meeting earlier in April, but there is still an informal process underway in the months before the review conference as well. The formal preparatory period that we've had has actually been shorter than it would normally be, again due to the compression of the time frame, mainly caused by COVID and the postponement of meetings. As I mentioned already, the NAM group was due to preside over this upcoming 9th review conference, but has passed its turn on, and in the end it was the Western group that is taking the presidency of the review conference this time round, and that's also on the understanding that NAM will preside over the 10th review conference due to take place 5 years from now. Another thing to bear in mind, as you will all obviously be aware anyway, is that I said already that the preparatory period is quite compressed, but the preparatory period is not only time to prepare for the BWC review conference. You will also be dealing with other meetings in the meantime, both here in Geneva, and also obviously the entire month of August will be occupied by the NPT 10th review conference taking place in New York as well, which obviously many of you will be heavily involved in too. So not only is the preparatory period for the BWC review conference shorter, it's also occupied with other important meetings as well. Just briefly to touch on the preparatory process, as I mentioned, it's the formal preparatory process is concluded now. We had a first meeting of the preparatory committee in December last year, which principally dealt with organizational and procedural issues that concluded. It was just a one-day meeting in December. It concluded with the adoption of an interim report. Then there was a longer and more substantive preparatory committee session in early April, so just a few weeks ago, which included a general exchange of views. It also included a debate over about 3 days, which comprehensively considered all of the provisions of the convention. And also, so it was an article by article review of the convention in some ways, and also addressed some of the cross-cutting issues, for example, science and technology. And it dealt with some of the remaining procedural issues, including the nomination of the president designate for the review conference, and also again adjusting the dates of the review conference as they had been due to take place this August. Obviously was clashing now with the NPT review conference, so the PrepCom decided that the review conference would take place in November, December, as I said. It concluded by adopting a final report. That report has been submitted. We're just waiting for our colleagues to finish the translation of that report into the other UN languages, and it will be issued in all UN languages shortly. There is an advanced version in English only available on our website for those of you who haven't yet taken a look at that report. Another feature of the preparatory process for the review conference is the preparation of various background documents. Now, some of these are prepared by us in the Implementation Support Unit, and you can see those listed here on the screen. There were 5 documents that we were requested to produce, and we produced those for the preparatory committee meeting earlier in April. You can see the different topics that those particular background papers covered. There's also links. Obviously, this presentation will be shared with you, so you can click these links, but these documents are all also available on the UN ODA meetings place website, along with all other BWC official documents. We also, at that stage, as well as these 5 documents, we also produced a report on the activities of the Implementation Support Unit, basically in the year since the last review conference. So that's also available as document number 8 on the website. And in addition to those 5 documents that were to be produced and have been produced by us in the Implementation Support Unit, the PrepCom also decided that we would compile a further 4 background documents altogether, but these are being compiled from national inputs. So we are basically, and states parties, you will be aware, and in fact 2 states parties so far have already submitted inputs for these 4 background documents as well. So in the time between now and, as you can see, the deadline for submission on the 12th of September, we hope to receive from you many more inputs to these 4 documents. You can see they deal with compliance by states parties with all obligations under the BWC on the implementation of Article 7 and Article 10, and also one on new developments in science and technology relevant to the convention. So, as I said, states parties are welcome to send us any time between now and the 12th of September their national inputs. The deadline is really to do with translation, because in order for these documents to be available in all UN languages before the review conference, they need to be submitted to us so that the translators can start work on them by the 12th of September. Just before I conclude, a few reflections on the upcoming 9th review conference to add a little bit more to what I said earlier. And I know you will also be hearing from other experts and participants in these meetings as well during the course. Obviously, external events, as with any multilateral meeting, external events shape the dynamics of a BWC review conference and affect their prospects. And that goes without saying, and I'm sure you're all very familiar with that issue anyway. Many states parties over the years have voiced the fundamental importance of strengthening the convention, and there have been a lot of proposals tabled during the just concluded intercessional program, showing increasing convergence on some particular topics as well that have been considered by the meetings of experts and meetings of states parties since 2018. And another issue that's worth flagging is also the need for a solid and sustainable financial footing for the convention in order to ensure its effective functioning. Without that stable and secure financial footing, meetings sometimes can't take place or have to take place with reduced services. Sometimes it has an impact on the staff in the Secretariat to service the meetings as well. So that's a particularly, it's in some ways a very mechanistic and kind of administrative issue, but also a very important one, and one which has caused challenges in the past few years for all of the disarmament conventions here in Geneva as well, particularly the late or non-payment of assessed contributions by some states parties. So that's another issue that the review conference will be touching on. We're also planning a series of events. As I mentioned, the kind of formal preparatory process for the review conference has concluded with the preparatory committee meeting last month. But we're also planning some events ourselves as the implementation support unit. We're also aware that states parties might well also be planning their own informal preparatory events too. From our side, what we're doing with funding that we have received from the European Union is a series of 4 basically regional preparatory meetings in the lead up to the review conference. So these will be taking place over the next few months in different parts of the world, basically covering all BWC states parties, so that they will be able to send representatives to these meetings to have informal but substantive discussions in the context of preparations for the review conference. We're also planning to organise an international conference on science and technology as well for governmental experts, academics, industry, non-governmental organisations and so on as well. That will also be taking place before the review conference as well, and relates back to the specific mandate that I mentioned from Article 12 of the Convention, that the review conference should specifically address developments in science and technology. So we hope that through those series of meetings, we can do our bit to help states parties to prepare for the review conference, to raise awareness about the review conference and the issues that will be discussed, and to provide a platform to provide opportunities for states parties in the particular regions to come together to discuss these issues, to network. We had a similar series of meetings before the 8th review conference, again funded by the European Union. You can see the picture from one of those meetings that took place in Kazakhstan back in 2016, and they were seen as quite useful to help states prepare for the review conference back then. So we hope that these series that we'll be embarking upon quite soon will be similarly useful for you preparing for the review conference this time round as well. And as I mentioned, just to conclude, here are the contact details for us in the implementation support unit. As I mentioned, we are a unit within the Office for Disarmament Affairs, so we are located in the same office in the new H building at the UN campus in Geneva, along with our colleagues working on the other disarmament issues here, who you'll be meeting and hearing from during the course of this orientation course. Our contact details are here, so please feel free, if you have any further questions, to reach out to us, to contact us, to get in touch, and we can provide you with more information. Be happy to respond to any comments or questions that you may have as well. Thank you again, thanks for your attention, and look forward to working with you all, particularly in the context of the upcoming 9th review conference. Thank you very much.